recently said, who is God? Who is the Lord that I should let the people go? We even see the Israelite children ask Moses, why is God doing this? Why is God allowing Pharaoh's slavery to get bad? And the scene is set, friends. Listen, the scene is completely set for God to show up, and for God to show up in a big way, in a declarative way, to show everyone involved, both Pharaoh, the Egyptians, Moses and Aaron, and the Israelite children, just who exactly the Lord really is. And so let's read together here in Exodus chapter 7, verse 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is unyielding. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he goes out to the river. Confront him on the banks of the Nile. And take in your hand the staff that was changed into a snake. And then he said to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to say to you, let my people go so they may worship me in the wilderness. But until now you have not listened. This is what the Lord says. By this you will know that I am the Lord. You remember Pharaoh's question that's going to haunt him now for 10 rounds? Who is the Lord that I should let my people go? Now, here's what the Lord, this is so that you will know that I'm the Lord. With the staff in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood. The fish of the Nile will die, and the river will stink, and the Egyptians will not be able to drink its water. The Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over the streams and over the canals, over the ponds and all the reservoirs, and they will be turned into blood. Blood will be everywhere in Egypt, even in vessels of wood and of stone. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord had commanded. He raised his staff in the presence of Pharaoh and his officials, and he struck the water of the Nile. And all the water was changed into blood. The fish of the Nile died, and the river smelled so bad that the Egyptians could not drink its water. Blood was everywhere in Egypt, but the Egyptian magicians did the same thing by their secret arts. And Pharaoh's heart became hard. He would not listen to Moses and to Aaron, just as the Lord had said. Instead, he turned and he went into his palace and did not even take even this to heart. And all the Egyptians dug along the Nile to get drinking water because they could not drink the water from the river. And for 9 more times, we see plagues like this come upon Egypt. We see plagues that come from every direction, upon which we'll talk about in just a moment. And with each one of these, Pharaoh's heart seemingly gets harder and harder. Until finally, after the 10th plague, Pharaoh's heart was softened enough to let the Israelite children go. Now, when we consider these plagues, and when we consider what it is that God did in this time in history, what is it that we can draw from these passages? And really, we look at this first plague as kind of a template for all of them. I encourage you, time just won't allow for us to explore all of them in full detail. So you're going to want to take some time to read chapter 7 and go all the way through, let's say, chapter 12 as you see each one of these unfold. We'll talk about them a little bit more detail in coming weeks. But as we look at them, what is it that we can learn from these plagues about the workings of God? Let's really focus our attention more towards God, because He's really the intrigue in this entire storyline. You see, all of the people have come to the table in their own way and from their own position. You have the Egyptians, you have Pharaoh, you have Moses and Aaron, and you have the Israelites. And all of them in their own way and in their own right have asked the question, who is the Lord, really? I mean, how is all of this going to happen? Moses argued with God about the power of God. Pharaoh has speculated as to the power of God. The people that both Moses and Pharaoh lead have speculated as to the power of God. And so in this moment, what is it that we can learn about God? And the first point is simply this, that God acts with power. You gotta know that, friends, that God acts with power. The plagues were all miraculous, supernatural, and out of the ordinary events. The language is clear here. God was going to work a miracle. They were no acts of nature, but they were acts of God. He can start them, and He can stop them when He chooses. The plagues come and go at the command of Moses and Aaron. The magicians were able to bring the frogs, but they could not get rid of them. That was God that could get rid of them. Pharaoh was asked multiple times. He would go to Moses as you read through these chapters and ask Moses to help him in the midst of these. You see, the magicians came and were able to mimic some of these realities, but ultimately it was God who was in control. God used Moses to go to Pharaoh, to get him to let God's people go. But Pharaoh's heart was hard, and thus God sent these plagues. And first he sent the Nile. The Nile was turned into blood, but then we see frogs. We see a rash of frogs break out over the land, and everywhere Pharaoh turned, he found a frog. Then the gnats, and then the flies, and then he killed the livestock, and then the boils, and the hail, and the locusts, and the darkness, ultimately to the death of the firstborn. One after another, after another, after another, God just continued to layer upon an answer to that question, who is the Lord that I should let his people go? Well, God spoke, and God spoke declaratively in the life of Pharaoh. In fact, in the third plague, we see even Pharaoh's magicians comment afterwards, this is clearly the finger of God. In chapter 8, verse 19, after gnats invade the land, this is clearly the finger of God at work, they said. You see, ironically, friends, as we look at the plagues, as some have been challenged throughout the years to suggest that these are natural phenomena, not miracles of God, that these are things that just happen in nature, these are not the act of God. I would argue that, in fact, it takes more faith to believe that all of these can take place naturally than to believe that God had really done it. You see, I think it's less of a faith presupposition to believe that God in the storyline here looks at it and says, in fact, that I'm going to call these to happen at this specific time, and I'm going to call them to leave at this specific time, and I'm going to do it because of the heart of a man who was holding God's people hostage, if you will. Nothing is normal or natural about these plagues at all. The execution of them, the timing of them, the beginning of them, the magnitude of them, or the end of them. And the fact that they happened on land and at water and in the sky, it shows that God is sovereign over everything. It reveals to us that God is in control of all things. And that God is in control not just of people, but of animals. He's in control of the water and the creatures that live within the water. He's in control of all of creation. That God is sovereign and is powerful enough to do anything he chooses to. He can make it start at his command. He can make it stop at his voice. He controls and directs whatever he wants, when he wants, in the way that he chooses to do so. Friends, we understand from this passage of Scripture, God is all powerful. It's interesting because the backdrop of a passage of Scripture like this would we would have to make a beeline back to the very beginning of time. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He created ex nihilo, which means he created out of nothing. He brought all of this to be. And friends, when you're the creator, then you have the ability and the right to step in and to adjust however you choose, to move and to act however you want. And in these 5 chapters, what we begin to clearly see is the mighty, powerful hand of God. Now, why is that important for us? Because, friends, today, you may be sitting here in this place and you're struggling with various issues in your life. We talk about the realities that all of us have problems and all of us have struggles. And even last week we talked about what it felt like to be in the presence of problems, to have to endure those difficulties, whether they're marital challenges or vocational challenges or health challenges or financial challenges or whatever those challenges may be in your life, whatever those problems may happen to represent themselves as. And friends, when we find ourselves in those moments, how comforting is it to know that the God that we pray to, and the God that we ask to intervene, and the God that we rely upon is a God that is all powerful. Yet so many times we forget that. That's why James encourages us that the prayer of the righteous man and the prayer that's offered in faith is powerful and effective and can change things. It can change you. It can change the circumstances you find yourself in. Because God is a powerful God. It reminds me of a story I read a number of years ago. A 24-year-old Danny who was sentenced to 6 years in jail for robbing a bank. He went to jail for having stolen just roughly $6,000 from the bank. But the gun that he used for that robbery ended up in a museum. Get a load of this. It was a .45 caliber Colt semi-automatic that was an antique gun. He didn't realize it. In fact, that gun was worth over $100,000. So he takes that gun in his hand and he walks into a bank. He steals $6,000, gets caught, ends up in prison, while the gun ends up in a museum. Don't you see the irony here that you steal $6,000 with a gun that costs $100,000? I think it's somewhat telling sometimes of us as believers. We take matters into our own hands, trusting in people and trusting in things and trusting in self-helps and trusting in the wisdom of man, when in fact, as God's people, we have the God of the universe, the all-powerful God on our side. And yet we're using a $6,000 gun, or a $100,000 gun in our hand to steal $6,000. Friends, if we would just rely upon the God that we love and the God that we serve, how easy would it be for us to be able to walk through these difficulties and these challenges, acknowledging that God is all powerful. It's not man's wisdom, but it's God's wisdom. It's not man's actions, but it's God's actions. It's not man's power, it's God's power that we are to rely upon. Day by day, moment by moment. When we reflect upon the plagues, we reflect upon the mighty power of God. But not only that, we reflect upon the reality that God acts with purpose. God acts with power, but God also acts with purpose. And in Exodus chapter 12, verse 12, we read these words, I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. Friends, you just can't get past this question that Pharaoh asks in chapter 5. Who is the Lord that I should let his people go? Well, God says declaratively, I am the Lord, and I'm going to prove it to you. And the Egyptians, like many other pagan cultures, they worshipped a wide variety of nature gods. And they believed and exercised power over natural phenomena that they see around them day by day. They worshiped the god of the sun, the god of the river, the goddess of fertility, the goddess of the earth, the god of protection over their crops. And one by one, we see God begin to attack every one of those false gods. He showed them indeed he was the Lord over the Nile. When the hail came to beat the crops, he showed them that he was the Lord over the crops. He showed them that he was the Lord over fertility. He showed them that he was the Lord over all things. And Pharaoh, who responds, who is the Lord that I should obey him? Well, in fact, he challenged God to show himself, and that is exactly what God did. God showed himself, and when he did so, not only did he act with power, but he acted with purpose. One by one, systematically, the plagues addressed the reality that God could take away the belief of the Egyptian gods over all and each of these distinct parts of life. One by one, they weren't random. They were not a theatrical display of God's power. They were executed to show that not one of the Egyptian gods were powerful enough to stop the hand of an almighty God. God acts with purpose, friends. You know, I think that in our office this week, we saw a purposeful God act. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, well, let me back up even 8 to 10 weeks ago. You all remember that Daryl went back to Detroit for the holidays. And we know that his dad was ailing and getting quite sick. And he came back, and I had talked with him just shortly after he had come back. And of course, I've talked with him about this story multiple times, even leading into this morning. And I said, Daryl, do you think that you're going to need to go back at various times throughout the year to just check on and see what's going on? He said, I really don't know, but we'll just kind of play it by ear and so on and so forth. And throughout January, we continued to see signs that he was declining, and I would continue to go to Daryl and say, Daryl, do you think you need to go back and take care of your mom? You need to be there for your family? What do you need to do? I'm not really certain, but we'll just play it by ear. About 3.5 to 4 weeks ago, he came and said, Mike, do you care if I go back towards the end of February? And there's a week there that looks good for me, and I think I can get back to go see him and see what's going on. We think that might be about the time they moved him into hospice. I said, Daryl, you know the answer is yes. I mean, you need to be there. You need to be there for your family. So yes, take all the time that you need. Go, be there with your mom, be there with your dad, be there with your sister. Take every amount of time that you need. So about 3.5 weeks ago, Daryl purchases a ticket to go back to Detroit. Now, we understand from our vantage point, as history and time has played itself out, that there's a storyline here that is proving to be awfully unique. He takes off on Wednesday morning at 6 o'clock in the morning, lands around 2 or around noon, shows up to the care facility around 2. He spends the afternoon with his father, and around 6 o'clock Denver time, which would have been 8 o'clock his time, we get word that his father passed away. Now, friends, I just believe, looking back on this, 3.5 weeks ago, God was acting with purpose in Daryl's life. It's ironic that in that last moments of his dad's life, he had stepped out. We were talking back and forth on the phone and text messaging, and he was getting all kinds of phone calls and various things. He had walked right back in the room and had decided to lead his family in prayer. He took his dad's hand, began to pray, and while he was praying, the Lord took him home. Now you tell me that's not the purpose of God at work in Daryl's life and in his family's life? Friends, that's how God moves, and that's how God works. When we surrender ourselves to Him, we see that He does things that just absolutely, how do you plan that kind of stuff? God moves with purpose. God moves with power. In the Egyptian life, in this context, we read this story and we think to ourselves, wow, that was quite a display and it's quite intriguing and it makes for a great 10-week sermon series when we look at all the theatrics. But the reality is when you strip all of that away, what God was doing was not creating a theatrical monologue and a play that could be put on a stage later in life. What God was doing was He was attacking each and every one of the Egyptian gods and declaring to Pharaoh right there, I am the Lord. You question who the Lord is? Well, I'm going to give you the answer. And He's not the God of fertility. He's not the God of the Nile. He's not the God over the land. He's not the God over the crops. He's not the God over all that. He is the God over everything. He is God Almighty. So why should you let my people go? Because I am God. God acts with power. God acts with purpose. But friends, I would conclude this morning by saying God acts with love. It's fair to ask the question, why are all the theatrics? Why doesn't God just cut to the chase and kill the Egyptian firstborn to begin with, and therefore Pharaoh's heart is softened and he lets the people go? Those are all fair questions, but friends, the answer for us this morning, an answer that we can deal with in the short term here, is that God is a powerful God. He's a purposeful God, but He's also a merciful God. And He is giving us time. He's giving us chances. He's giving us an opportunity. The closer and closer Pharaoh has the opportunity to look at these plagues, the closer and closer that all the magicians come in and give their counsel, the more and more the people evaluate what's happening here. the more and more opportunity Pharaoh has to begin to come to grips with who it is that God Almighty is. You know, friends, I've got to confess to you today, could God have started with the 10th plague? Could God have changed his heart immediately? Could God have stepped in and made life miserable for him? Could God have done all that? I absolutely, definitively, and declaratively would say I believe yes. But I'm really glad that God is a God of chances. And that God is a God of opportunity. And that God gives me time to deal with some of these realities. Because you know, friends, the reality of life is we all have a little bit of Pharaoh in us. We all have at times in our life a little bit of unyieldedness within us. We all have time in our life in which we just simply look around and we're just not willing to deal with what it is that we find. We're hard-hearted, we're stubborn, we're stiff-necked people. Each and every one of us. We all have times in our life in which that monologue describes us. And the fact that God gives us time, and that he acts with love, and that he acts with compassion, and that he's merciful, and he gives us chance after chance after chance after chance after chance. Friends, listen, Pharaoh's heart was so hard that when we're dealing with the frogs, if you'll go through it in chapter 8 and you begin to read, the frogs begin to come up around Egypt, and they just kind of begin to take over Egypt. And if you'll read that text, we don't have time to look at it right now, but if you'll read that text, what we begin to see is that the frogs make their way into the city limits, the frogs make their way into Pharaoh's palace, the frogs make their way into Pharaoh's bedroom. The frogs are everywhere. Friends, listen, frogs are everywhere. I cannot comprehend what this looks like. If in my life, when there are things outside that I don't like, if mosquitoes are really bad, if the rain is pouring, if the hail is coming, whatever the case may be, I just go inside and I separate myself from this. But here, the frogs in this situation, there is no going inside and separating yourself from the frogs. They are in your room. They're in your house. You're stepping on them. You're eating cereal with the frogs right there amongst you. And as all that is happening, I want you to look here in chapter 8, verse 9. Look at how hard-hearted Pharaoh's heart is. Moses said to Pharaoh, I will leave you the honor of setting the time for me to pray for you and your officials and your people, that you and your houses may be rid of the frogs, except for those that remain in the Nile. And listen to what Pharaoh says. Well, let's do it tomorrow. Do it tomorrow. Hey, friends, really, tomorrow? Why tomorrow? Pharaoh's heart was so hard, do it tomorrow? I mean, Pharaoh, let's put it in our own words. Pharaoh, when do you really want to obey? And Pharaoh says, well,